Our next speaker, Dr. Kim. I'm pleased to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Kim Binstead. Dr. Binstead received her bachelor's degree in physics from McGill University, her PhD in artificial intelligence from the University of Edinburgh, and in 2002, Kim joined the faculty of Information and Computer Sciences at the University of Hawaii. In 2003 and 2004, she was a NASA Summer Research Fellow at the Ames Research Center, where she worked on subvocal speech recognition technology. Kim has been the chief scientist on the FMARS long duration mission, which was a 4-month Mars exploration analog that was conducted in Devon Island in the Canadian High Arctic. She's a co-investigator currently on a space food study called the Hawaii Space Analog and Simulation Study. And throughout the workshop, we've been talking about the prospect that intelligence on other worlds may not be biological, but perhaps artificial. So Kim's, especially her early expertise in modeling artificial intelligence, I think is especially relevant. One of her early projects was a program with the acronym JAPE, Joke Analysis and Production Engine. So this was a program that would generate puns. And my favorite that was created by her program was this one. What do you call a Martian who drinks beer? An alien. Okay. And here is Kim Binstead to tell us about aliens of whatever form.
All right, thank you very much. Okay, so I have to admit at this point that everything I had planned to say has been said. So I'm going to say it again, but in less professional language so that whatever your specialty is, you can cringe at my mishandling of your field. And then I'll go over that. The gist is why the task we're facing is hard. I don't think I need to do too much convincing of that, but also why in particular natural language is a poor form for that. And I'd hope that some of the linguistic details would be new to you, but unfortunately the previous talk just blew that out of the water as well. And then because I feel the need to do something new, I'm going to make a little proposal at the end, which was developed at the dinner table last night after a few glasses of wine, just because it's fun to shoot it down. Okay, so here's my agenda today is generally pessimism, and I'm going to be looking at the tension between shared knowledge and new knowledge. So the knowledge we assume we share with whoever we're trying to talk to, and the new knowledge we introduce, which is the reason we're communicating after all, is to tell them something they don't already know. And unfortunately, we don't know where the line between those two categories is, and I think that's one of the basic problems of message composition. We don't know where the shared knowledge ends and where the new knowledge begins. So I'll be talking a little bit about natural languages, such as English, other human languages, and why they're not a good idea. I'll talk a bit about formal languages and why they're not a good idea, about images and other media and why they're not a good idea. Then I will give some good news and make some recommendations. Okay, so this is the basic problem. We need a Venn diagram of this type, but I don't know how to draw it. So instead of drawing it, I'll just say what the categories are, and you have to imagine in your head where and how they might overlap. So there are the things that we already know. This can include our knowledge of science, of physics, our own language, certain kinds of logic. We know quite a lot about math, and that's fine. What they know, whoever it is that we're talking to, that may or may not involve a subset of the things that we know. It might be a superset of the things that we know. What is the overlap between those? What is the shared knowledge that we can then use to construct a pidgin, a simplified language of some kind, and I'm using language in the broadest sense here, some representation that's intended to communicate. What can we use to construct that pidgin, that language? What do we then want to tell them once we've constructed this pidgin? What is the content of the message? What is the new knowledge that they presumably don't have that we are attempting to communicate. What is the stuff that they might learn from our message that we don't want them to know? What of the things that we know, for example, we've talked about humans not being necessarily moral. Is that something we want to communicate? And if it's not something we want to communicate, how do we prevent communicating it accidentally? And in order to prevent communicating it accidentally, we should know what it is, the things that we don't want them to know. Do we not want them to know our location? That might be a little hard to hide. Maybe, maybe not. But if it is something we don't want them to know, we should know that we don't want them to know it. What are the false things that we want them to believe? Now, maybe that's an empty set. Maybe we're honest and we're taking a position of honesty. If it is an empty set, that's a good thing to know as well. But it might not be an empty set. And if it isn't, then we should know what's in it. Stuff that we don't know yet. So this is things that's in their knowledge set, but that we would really like them to tell us. And if there's anything in that set, then we should probably ask them for it. Hey, do you know anything about, oh, I don't know, cold fusion? Please tell us. That would be awesome. And then, based on these categories that we need to know, we then need to figure out what will actually constitute this message. So there are some assumptions here, obviously. If we can come up with a pigeon, or if we want to develop a Rosetta Stone or a set of Rosettas, that might be in there. Our actual content of our message might be in there. It might be sending everything we know. It might be the giant big data dump that we've been talking about. But what that message is based on everything in all of those other sets. And until we know what's in those other sets, we're not going to be able to compose the message. So the problem I'm trying to suggest here is that we don't know what that diagram looks like. So why is natural language a problem? This has been talked about already, but natural language is a very, very efficient mode of communication. Now, there's a lot of redundancy in it, but it is hugely efficient because it depends on the individuals at either end being more or less identical. Okay, we have the same brain, we have the same set of senses, we have the same motivations. So, for example, when you look at a tomb, we can make some pretty strong assumptions that the writing on the outside of the tomb is probably about the person inside. And if it's a very fancy tomb, then it's probably boasting about the person inside. If it's a not so fancy tomb, it might be saying what their crimes were and why they were put to death. We can start telling those stories. What it probably isn't is a shopping list. Okay, the fact that it's on a tomb constrains the content of the message significantly, and we know that because we're humans. And even though there's different cultures on Earth, they are really closely related. And the timeline we're talking about and the separations are relatively short. So there's a lot of shared history as well. And even with that, even with those huge commonalities, to the point that we are almost the same creatures, we have a lot of difficulty decoding messages without an intermediary language. Arguably no success without an intermediary language, although we can fight about that over a beer. But certainly extremely limited success. When we have found a new text, it's either required a Rosetta Stone or similar, or the discovery that there is an existing language that we can understand that is significantly related to the one that we're trying to decode. So again, even though we're the same beast, there's very, very challenging communication problems. Okay, so can we make a Rosetta Stone? Nice idea. The Rosetta Stone's text was fantastic. It was 3 parallel texts, one which was very well understood, ancient Greek, and one which was not well understood, which was the Egyptian hieroglyphics, and they had the same content. Fantastic, parallel texts. However, the Rosetta Stone has a couple of characteristics that it would be very challenging for us to put into our artificial Rosetta Stone. One is, again, it's about people, okay? So in this case, and my understanding is that the text was about a particular ruler's activities and how awesome this ruler was and all the things that this ruler did that benefited the priests and the people of people of Egypt. So, great. This is already something that we have a lot of context for. Even the ancient Greek piece we only really understand because, again, we understand what it means to have a ruler doing beneficial things for humans and what all of the repercussions of that are. So that helped a great deal in then understanding the other texts. So we could make a Rosetta Stone based on what we assume is shared knowledge. So, for example, of physics, of math, maybe some chemistry, and so on. But could we then use it to talk about anything except physics, or whatever the domain of our Rosetta Stone is? Now, we can start to try to do this, but you notice when I've done this sort of exercise in my head and on paper a few times, but you start to notice you get into metaphors really quickly. Language is highly metaphorical, and even words that seem very concrete and specific are actually used for a very wide range of meanings, which could very much be a problem if our listeners' metaphors are not the same. So, for example, just take the word great. Great. It's generally speaking a positive. It's associated with size. This pharaoh was a great ruler, and being great was powerful and also enabled this ruler to do great things for the people of Egypt. But all of those uses of the word great I just used there are quite different. And only if our listener has the same association between size, power, and positivity, are they going to be able to make the same metaphorical leaps. So I would argue that I can't think of a way to make a Rosetta Stone based on shared knowledge that would be applicable to, say, anything outside of that shared knowledge. Prove me wrong. It'd be fun. Okay, so and then there's this, and again, I apologize to the linguists in the audience. I'm going to misuse your field, abuse your field horribly here. Language is deceptively easy, and that's because our brain is specialized, whether at the physiological level or at a higher level. It's highly specialized to learn language. Or you could say the other way around, language is highly specialized to be learned by the set of equipment that we have. Either way, doesn't really matter. We've got highly specialized sensors, processors, actuators. The tongue is one, for example, that are very good at the language that we have developed. And children don't learn language from scratch. They're not general purpose thinking machines. Well, this is taking one of the hypotheses from the previous talk, but still, close enough. It's a little bit like adjusting parameters in a language machine. It's not a complete learning from scratch behavior. I'm not going to go over this because that was covered much better in the previous talk. And then finally, we don't learn language passively as much as the ironically named company Rosetta Stone would like us to think we do. Language learning is a very active and interactive process. The example of holding up the cup from the previous talk and negotiating what the terms of the conversation are going to be. And if you don't have the terms of the conversation shared, if you don't follow the same sort of Gricean maxims, then identifying that cup and finding the word for that cup is going to be very challenging. We've talked a little bit about interspecies communication. Anyone who knows me knows I always find a way to work a picture of my dog into a talk, and that's Cosmo in the upper left there. He's a delight. So there's three main ways that we have been communicating with animals. One is teaching them what we want, which is interactive but largely one way. Hey dog, I'm going to teach you to wear clothes and sit up and generally do the things I want you to do. Some of that is more subtle. So my dog learns things from me that I don't want him to learn. But nonetheless, it's still a process of me teaching the dog what I want. We observe animals communicating within a species. So we talked about the hawk alert earlier. That's communication within a species. And then in some limited cases, we have evolutionarily highly motivated cases where we've learned another animal's warning signs. So here we have a panther. Someone 2 nights ago was describing being at a zoo, walking around the corner, being faced with a panther behind in a fairly open cage, and the panther giving a deep growl and having this sort of very primal, we should be moving away from here response to that. So that is an example of us learning that particular communication and responding to it. But again, all of these are highly interactive, and they're highly contextual, and they're based on a shared world, a shared history, and even with all of that shared context, they're still not easy. We still don't really understand another species' modes of communication. Okay, so why are we doing this? And this is looking at what we are trying to express. So here's a knife. I decided to use a picture of a knife because Saturday morning I decided to punch one for some reason, so it's very fresh in my head. So what can we say about this knife? And this is a brief tour of classical pragmatics, which is why you are saying what you're saying. So referential. I have a knife. I'm giving you some information. You now have the information that I have a knife. Fantastic. But that's not the only kinds of communications we have, of course. There's expressive. So in this case, I'm telling you something about my attitude towards the knife. So I know how to use a knife. Okay. Now again, I'm giving these paraphrases here, but most of these can be still contained in the same text. I have a knife. Okay. So I have a knife. I have a knife. Okay, that was poor intonation, but you can get the idea that the same text can have these various different purposes. So here I'm telling you something about how my attitude towards the knife. An imperative, drop your weapons or I'll knife you. Okay, so that's telling you to do something, and there's an implied promise about my action depending on what choices you make. Poetic, is this a dagger which I see before me? Okay, so in that case, there's some narrative function. It's an aesthetic function. I'm not trying to convey actual information to you. I'm trying to cause an emotional response in your brain by saying this. Phatic, I'm misusing phatic a little bit here. These are social purposes. Is that a knife in my pocket, or am I just happy to see you? In this case, it's a social function. I'm trying to make you laugh. Partial success. And then metalingual. So this whole talk is metalingual at some level. A sentence about a knife possession can have many linguistic interpretations. And this is an important category for us because if we have some kind of primer, if we have some kind of Rosetta Stone, that's going to be metalinguistic content in the message. So in order for us to successfully convey a message, our recipient is going to have to understand the pragmatics of our message as well as the content. Why are we telling them this? So if we tell them all we know about physics, are we telling them that in a metalinguistic way to establish a primer? Are we telling them that because we're boasting about all the stuff we know? Are we telling them that because we think they don't know it and we want to help them out? Are we telling them that so that they know we have the ability to build a nuclear weapon and they should back off? This is all content that will be carried one way or another, and we should know which one we're trying to do. Okay, so if natural languages are a problem, how about formal languages? So I was very pleased to find this cartoon yesterday. When you thought I was not listening to your talk, I was looking for this. It pleases me a great deal. So formal languages reduce ambiguity and complexity. That's nice. Then we can have a better idea that we are saying what we think we're saying. But we still have the grounding problem. And this is the relationship between the symbol and what we intend the symbol to refer to. And it's very, very hard when you're not standing in front of someone with a cup in your hand to make that connection. And even if you are standing in front of with someone with a cup in your hand, there can be ambiguity there about what you're referring to. Okay, One proposal for how you ground these symbols is through images. And again, I know we've all said this, I'm just going over it again. So I'm going to get some audience feedback here. What is this a picture of?
Average bathroom.
Puppies, an average bathroom. Cuteness. The internet. Any others? A drawer, yeah? I propose 7. I think that's a pretty good one. Youth, perhaps? There's 10, yeah. 10 because of the mirror. Also the concept of reflection, maybe, is in there. Without, it's very, very hard to pick a picture where there aren't, you can't do that with. It's very difficult. And so pictures are problematic, and pictures are problematic also for the reason mentioned in the previous talk, which is that we use pictures because we are very good. Our whole sensory system is set up to do this translation from a 4-dimensional world, so 3D in time. And the time part is very important because part of how we process the world has to do with flow. So how we move through it has a significant effect on how we process visually. So we go from a 4D world to a series of 2D retinal images. All sorts of funky processing is done on it, including edge detection, this flow that I mentioned, until somewhere in our head we have something that's kind of like a 3-dimensional model and an interpretation of, within that 3-dimensional model, what are the objects, how do they relate to each other, what's behind what, and so on. So that's what we then try to convey. And then when we try to express it outbound, we have to figure out what that model is, what the interpretation is, what our communication goals are, what our model of our audience is, so how do they perceive the world, and that produces, and then profit. So it's hard to know how best to express, if we want to express the 3D model, how best to express it. And I would argue that unless our listener has a very similar visual system to us, that pictures are not going to be tremendously useful. Particularly line-drawn pictures. I mean, that whole edge detection thing that we do is super funky, and I don't know if it's necessarily useful universally. Okay, sounds. Sounds have a similar problem. We've got our physiological structures that are tuned to our particular environment. We don't hear very well underwater, for example. Our processing system separates the important sounds from the background noise, and that is a distinction that, again, is highly tuned to our particular situation. We can encode this as pitches or multiple pitches and volume over time. We can then re-encode it as a digital stream. But what to extract from that, the meaning that we would like someone to extract from that, depends, of course, on cultural history and species and so on. And the intermediary encodings could be very confusing. So what you see up here, can anyone recognize that? Yes? Very good. Both of those are the opening notes of Beethoven's Fifth. One in musical notation, one as pitch and volume over time, roughly. And they look quite different. And I do not think it is necessarily intuitive how you might go from one to the other, or indeed from either of those to a sound that would have any meaning. And music is actually easier than speech when it comes to extracting meaning at some level from it, getting back to the representation, as it were. Okay, so I taught a grad course on the evolution of intelligence a few years back. In fact, that's how I got into this whole mess. That's how I got to speak to Jill and so on. And one of the tasks I gave the grad students is I divided them to 2 groups. I motivated them by making their grade dependent on it, and I asked them to decode 2 different messages. One was the very familiar message on the right, and the other was slices of the human body. So there was a project that took a corpse and sliced it up and took images of it and made those available. To make it more challenging, what I did is I put both of these, well, the one on the right was already in black and white. I made the other one also into a binary image, or rather the whole set into a binary image. I gave the dimensions of the images at the beginning. I made, if I recall, the series of 0 at the beginning was the x dimension, and this series of 1s was the y dimension, if I recall. And then I linearized it and introduced noise. Small amount of noise, not a lot, small amount of noise. And also I gave them bonus points for which team came back with an interpretation first. So they were motivated to get it done quickly. They got the 3D body within a few hours, and they never understood the Arecibo image. And I have to say, one of the students came to me and he said, look, I know you said no internet, and I didn't go online, but I had actually seen the Arecibo image before. I just couldn't remember how to decode it. So even knowing what it was, he was a smart guy, and he shared this with the team. They couldn't figure it out. Not the whole thing. So again, back to the theme. What do you already need to know in order to understand? So here are some very useful representations. I'd like to just remind you all that these are all actually represented as images. So there's a secondary representation here. I would argue E equals mc squared on the left is effectively useless as new knowledge. In order to understand that equation, you already need to understand that equation. In the sense that you already need to understand what all of the pieces of it mean. And if you understand what all the pieces of it mean, assuming you've had an Einstein at some point, you probably already know what the equation is. The second example is a piece of highly ambiguous English, but a very understandable piece of English. You guys aren't even in the context of this sentence, and I think you understand it. The bank was closed, so you'll have to get this round. What am I communicating there? I don't have any cash, so you have to buy the drinks. Okay, and I can tell you right now that there is not a computer in the world that can understand that sentence, and it's very annoying to those of us who've worked in natural language processing, but ambiguity and context still undermine a huge amount of that process, even though we've gotten better at it. The third image is, of course, of a fingerprint, and I would say that this is analogous to the idea of sending DNA. It is a very useful way of identifying an individual if you already know most things about humanity. It's not very useful if you don't. And then, of course, we've got a map of Europe here. As an image, it's already problematic, but in order to recognize what the lines on it are, you need to know about things like borders and countries and so on. Fair enough. Okay, I've over-ranted here. So let's move on to the positive side. I would like to introduce you to my horrible, horrible doorbell. I just moved into a new condo, and this thing, it's sort of a brick-sized, normally plastic covered, but I took that off, thing that sits on the wall, and it is literally a 1-bit device. It is dinging or it is not dinging, okay? It's got quite a long ding. It goes ding dong, ding dong, ding dong, but that doesn't add anything to it, okay? It's either someone is hitting the button or they aren't. It's wired into the wall. Okay, so it's an incredibly over-engineered response to the problem of how I can tell someone's at the door. And by the way, my condo is small enough that I can tell someone's at the door by the sound of their breath. So it is really not a very useful device. Okay, even though it's a 1-bit device, though, with context, it can tell me quite a lot more than 1 bit of information. So it tells me that someone is at the door. The existence part of that is very important. It tells me their location. They're at the door, or at least they were a second ago, because someone hit the button. It may tell me something about their intention. In particular, they want me to know that they're there, probably. Which means they're probably not there to rob the house, which is good. That's a useful piece of information. There's some other hypotheses. That could be kids on Halloween ringing my doorbell and running away, but that's one other possible intention. But well, most of the time we can assume that someone's there with good intentions. It shows that they know how to use a doorbell, so it says something about their technological knowledge. They're able to press the button, so they are tall enough and they have fingers or some other appendage that is appropriate for hitting the button. So that's quite a lot of information. And it tells me a little bit about what they think about me. So they think that I'm capable of understanding the fact that they're pressing the button means that I should come to the door and answer it. And it also says that they expect that I'm home. Otherwise, they wouldn't bother ringing the doorbell. So there we are. There's actually quite a lot you can get from someone hitting that button. So here are my morals of the story and my recommendations. A doorbell type message is relatively easy. These are the pings that we were talking about earlier. And even though it's kind of technically 1 bit, in context it carries a lot of useful information with it. Designing a message that can carry anything more than that useful information is very hard, and I would argue that interpreting accidental messages, so messages that aren't designed to be interpreted, is bordering on impossible, given that we don't have the shared context that enables all of the communication we know about today. The briefer the message is, more or less, the more compressed it is, and our compression strategies are typically informed compression strategies, so they're based on both the content of the message and the context and what we understand about the recipient. So the very fact that we're using compression reduces the chances that it's going to be understood. And then the encoding of the message depends on our shared context, the method we choose to encode it. The content is the new knowledge we're trying to communicate, and the fact that we don't know the line between the two is problematic. So here's my recommendation. Do send big data, but send it in as many different encodings as we can think of. Do send parallel data, so Rosetta Stones, but don't count on any single one of them working. Just come up with as many as we can. And hopefully our recipient will be able to interpret part of the message. This is a bit of Pigeon from Hawaii, which I felt was appropriate. If can. If no can, no can. So if they can interpret part of it, great. They're unlikely to be able to interpret all of it. So be it. And even if they fail to interpret anything that we've encoded, at worst it's a doorbell, which is still a useful signal. And in Seth's scenario, he's out of the room, so you won't hear that. It's a very, 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 very long doorbell. But still, doorbells are useful. And then my quick proposal, I have a minute? Okay. That we came up over dinner last night. So if we are going to send unstructured data, how about we try to eliminate the biases of this particular, the people who happen to be in this room, the people who tend to be involved in these kind of discussions, and instead take what Earth is saying, which right now in 2014 is Twitter. So let's just take what the top tweets on Twitter are. Maybe not as such, maybe we want to process them a little bit. Maybe we want to use the existing markers, so they're effectively pseudo-linguistic markers. We've got a hashtag for the topic of the tweet. We've got an @ for the people or the institutions involved in the tweet. And we have links connecting to richer media. We might want to add a few more markers. I think it would be nice if there was a verb marker so you could identify the action of the tweet. So then you've got something like a semi-structured sentence. We might want to integrate some tweets, so if everyone's saying that Justin Bieber sucks, we don't need to have all of those. We could concentrate them together into one sentence and send them out. 1 a day, 1 million a day, 1 billion a day. I think that's a, well, shoot it down. It is at least a semi-democratic way of composing a message. It is what Earth is thinking about in the larger sense right now. If we're gonna, if we want to tell them what we're thinking, then maybe that's a way to do it. And then finally, oh yeah, so here's an example, which I kind of liked. This is one of the meme of films with one letter missing, and it's 28 days late with a picture of someone pushing a baby carriage. So there we are. And I just wanted to show a pretty picture of my project because I want to make you guys go to the website. And that's it. Thank you.
I have a question on the Twitter idea, since we were chatting about that last night, and I wondered what would the effect be of the fact that nobody can spell on Twitter?
Well, kind of seriously.
Seriously.
It doesn't matter. I mean, we have many synonyms for the same concepts anyway, and you know, a symbol is a symbol at some level. So you could treat, you probably should treat a misspelled word as a synonym for the correctly spelled word.
Thank you for this talk. I really enjoyed it, and the linguists are all happy with everything you did, by the way. Just for the record, I have a comment about the Twitter idea and a question for you. I like the Twitter idea very much because there's so much redundancy in sending the whole Google serve thing that the Twitter would at least give some indication of what part of that we think is interesting or what part of that is most kind of salient to us at any given time. Because sending a whole bunch of redundant information, that's going to be really hard to sort, and so at least what people are poking at and referring to is, I think, a window into what part of that information is salient to us. So I kind of like that idea. Don't send mine, but send everybody else. And here's my question about sort of the accessibility of learning the languages. What if we did something like some pedagogy, like the model rival? What is it? The rival model that Irene Pepperberg used with Alex. So you send images or feeds or some kind of encoding of language lessons. So you have a teacher and a student, and you know the teacher holds up whatever cup, whatever, and says cup, and the student says cup. If they get the hook that's pedagogy, and maybe even there are two people there, and one person says cup, and the other person says window, and like, no, that one's wrong, this one's right. Might that not be a way into something that isn't physics?
Yes. So sort of a fake interaction, right? Where we're going to get all kind of Plato on them and give them the interaction where we've got a teacher and a not very bright student, and it can work through it that way. Yeah, I think something like that would help. You still have encoding issues, so you'd want to send that in like 50 different ways, you know, video and audio and images and 3D models and so on. And yeah, and then hope for the best. Yeah. Maybe
we could think that there is a kind of universal history of civilization trying to communicate with other civilizations, and that with more advanced civilizations, we could postulate that they have also tried in their own past history to communicate with other civilizations, which could lead to a context of understability. It means that more advanced civilization could have developed means, whatever it could be, psychological, technological, or health, in order to be able to deal with the communications of less advanced civilization.
That's entirely possible, but if I always get a little nervous about the more advanced civilization can do something that we don't even have the slightest idea how to do idea, because then we might as well not even try. You know, if we have to assume that they can do something that we don't know how to do in order for this communication to take place, why are we bothering to compose anything? They'll figure it out no matter what we send.
Because your way is maybe the good one. The situation is desperate, but we should try nevertheless.
Yeah.
I have another remark about interspecies communication. In one of your first slides, you have shown three kinds of interspecies communications. I should add another one: human trying to communicate with animals. And I think that it succeeds, but it's very difficult. And it could be also an issue we could try to think harder on. The difficulty we have to communicate with really less intelligent or less complex, whatever it could mean, species. For instance, it's very difficult to communicate with ant colonies. And ant colonies seems not to be so complex a kind of creatures. So if we have to communicate with really much more complex civilizations, it could be really very hard.
Yeah, I think you're right. There's some attempts to communicate with animals in their own language, in the loosest sense. Most of the communication we do with animals is teaching them to understand our language. But you're right. And a lot of those cases, we're not being particularly honorable communicators. So the most example I heard about recently is about bats. So we've learned that bats interfere with each other's echolocation deliberately so that they can steal the food that the other bat was going for. And the way we found this out is by doing it ourselves, so messing with them, lying to them at some level. But yeah, it's very interesting, and it should be on the list, yeah.
So a little bit of snarky comment about the Twitter is you said send them what we're thinking about, but I think the tweets are from people who aren't thinking. But literally, to me, the information content in Twitter is the redundancy and the replication and all of those demographics and data that we can mine from it, which won't come, it isn't accessible unless you send them all.
Yeah, you may well be right. So for example, if we got this stream, and assuming we were able to do some initial pre-processing on it, we would notice the hashtags. And I think one of the first things we would try is to see what all of the things with the same hashtag have in common. And that would be a really interesting lever to maybe doing some higher comprehension. And also the links in them, I've poo-pooed the value of images, but those links are to all sorts of things. And again, that you could call it random, that richness could be quite interesting.
This is a great talk, and I particularly appreciate the doorbell example, which I will use repeatedly, hopefully with attribution. But there's something that makes me uneasy about some of the discussion, and I think Seth's out of the room, so I'll go ahead and say this, and that is throwing lots of information. Way back, I mean, we can't manage the amount of information we have. When I was a graduate student, which was before most people here were born, University of Michigan started the Center for Research and Utilization of Scientific Knowledge because it was coming in too fast in 1963. At one point, it behooved me to read some books on management. And one of the things that came through very clear in some of these books, much of which had horrible information in them, was that there's a curvilinear relationship between the amount of information you have and your ability to make a decision and act on it. And the example they gave, which was very, very clever, was something like, should you take 1 aspirin a day? So, they give you 5 reasons. What do you think? Well, then they give you 5 reasons not to. And this sort of progresses. And at the end, you're sitting there thinking, gee, I don't know what I would do. And so it's just sort of a caution. I mean, this is a lousy example, but when I go to, say, New Jersey or New York, Manhattan, really New Jersey, I love to listen to the babble on the New York radio stations, every language and so forth. But how long would I have to listen to those to start seeing patterns? So it's not meant to be a completely cold water thing, but I think that here, give them everything. It's sort of like that motto here, we'll kill them and let God sort it out. Maybe there's a better way to go about it.
I should just be clear, I'm not advocating for sending. I don't like the send Google. Yeah. What I I do think is we should send structured information, but because we don't know the best way to structure it, we should try every good structure we can think of, which is a slightly different version of the throw everything at the wall and see what sticks approach. Or Twitter.
Thank you very much, Kim. Let's give her a hand.